Good morning, Ohio State fans, and welcome back to the 11 Dubcast for Wednesday, September 10th. I am joined by our deputy editor at 11 Warriors, Dan Hope. Dan, how are you on this fine middle of the week as we prepare for the Ohio State Ohio game this coming Saturday?
Doing well. It feels like, we're full swing into football season now. Hard to believe it's already week 3.
It's only natural to feel like full swing after playing a team like Texas first game out of the gate. Before we get into the nitty gritty on the Dubcast today, we do want to give a shout out to our sponsor at 11 Warriors this football season, First Bank of Central Ohio, official sponsor of the 11 Dubcast. From game day to workday, First Bank of Central Ohio is proud to support the business owners that keep Central Ohio thriving, locally owned, business focused, and always in your corner. Give them a visit at fbcentralohio.com. Dan, let's talk transfer portal because we had an interesting news item last week about a proposal from the NCAA Football Oversight Committee that apparently we're going to go from 2 transfer portal cycles to just 1. Now, this was something that I previously talked about back when Johnny was co-hosting the show with me earlier in the offseason. And frankly, we think that this does make sense if the timing is done correctly. However, if you're a team like Ohio State that is regularly competing for national championships and being within the conversation of the college football playoff, then the proposed timing here is probably not going to be something that you're too fond of because they are looking at a 1-day window in January, which is right around when the 4 team stage of the playoff going into the national championship would be happening. Obviously, if your team is still in contention at that point, you're probably more liable to lose players to the portal than you are in a position to be bringing them in. Yesterday, Ryan Day had some thoughts on that. He said, I don't think it's a good idea at all. In the conversations that we had with the Big Ten coaches, I think the majority of them agree. I just don't quite understand how teams that are playing in the playoffs are expected to make the decisions and sign their upcoming players while they're still getting ready to play for games. It doesn't make any sense to me. With that in mind, Dan, I'm wondering if you can relay to us how likely is it that this change, given the resistance that is coming from coaches like Ryan Day, is going to go forward next month? And are the fears that I just kind of outlined for programs like Ohio State justified in terms of what that would kind of do relative to competitive balance, which is a good thing for the sport in general? But again, if you're supporting a team like Ohio State that's at the top, you're obviously in a disadvantaged position with this proposal as it's currently outlined.
Well, I would guess that it will go forward because typically when you see the way these NCAA legislative processes work, typically when the Football Oversight Committee recommends something, it's more of a procedural matter of formality that, the administrative committee will ultimately push it through. Now, with that being said, it does sound like in this case, there is still an active effort being led by the Big Ten, by Tony Petitti, by people like Ryan Day to change this protocol because, like you said, the reason why Ryan Day does not like this, why certain people do not like this is you look at when that 10-day window would be from January 2 to January 11. The national championship game won't be played until January 19th. And so that means if you're Ohio State, you have all these players entering the portal. You have to be actively building your roster for next season while you're preparing for a college football playoff semifinal, potentially a college football playoff national championship game. Now, but obviously that's only going to affect 4 teams because the quarterfinals will be done before this window starts. And so I think the reason why it might ultimately move forward is people are going to say, well, this makes sense for most of college football. It's not going to make sense for a select few. Kirby Smart had the quote when he was talking about it in May. He said, it's really hard to be playing in a championship setting and having to deal with that. When I brought that up as a complaint or a problem, I was told there's no crying from the yacht. So there's going to be a lot of coaches out there who are going to look at Ryan Day and say, boo hoo. I mean, too bad that the program that perennially competes for national championships is going to have a harder time than the rest of us managing the transfer portal. So I think his comments may fall on deaf ears to some, but it does sound like within the Big Ten, Tony Petitti you got to give him credit. He's done a really good job on these legislative issues of really rallying the troops around him. We saw it at Big Ten Media Days, the big push for 9 conference games, for everybody to play 9 conference games. Lo and behold, a month later, the SEC is playing 9 conference games. So I think the Big Ten has done a good job of rallying its troops kind of around these issues. The problem here is the SEC, the ACC, and the Big 12 all want that January window. And so the Big Ten's outnumbered here, and they might be fighting an uphill battle to try to get this changed. The biggest problem is with the calendar constructed the way it is, there's no really great solution here. The Big Ten, what they want is for the portal to be in April, end of spring, which makes sense on multiple levels. It coincides with the actual academic year. So you have guys transferring at the end of an academic year, not in the middle of an academic year. It also would correspond with when revenue sharing agreements start, and you have guys. But the way this works, these academic years with the settlement, they start July 1, and so it makes more sense to have new players coming in the summer than it does in the winter. But the biggest drawback of that would be then you have spring practice, and then after spring practice, you're going to have all this roster movement. And so, that's why there was some talk, a few months ago about, could spring practices go away? Do they get replaced by OTAs in the summer? If the only portal window was in April or May, that would take a lot of the value away from spring practices. So I think that's why we've gone back toward the January timeline here. I mean, the biggest challenge of all this is that pesky academic calendar, because the lot from a football strictly perspective, what would make sense for everybody is the portal opens the day after the national championship game. It's that's kind of how it works in college basketball. It opens when the NCAA tournament starts, but it's open long enough that it's like not as big of a deal. But like the big thing that would make sense is like have this 10-day window. It opens the day after the national championship game. That way everybody's season is done, and you don't have this worry about players leaving, coming and going, teams that are still in the college football playoff. I mean, the college football playoff, this is your marquee product in the sport. It's not good to have a transfer portal window in the middle of that potentially adversely impacts the biggest games of the season. The problem is, you look at, winter semesters everywhere, spring semesters start in January. So if you have players transferring in February, it's a lot harder to get players enrolled in new schools. And as long as the NCAA wants to continue with, their student athletes, their students first, they can't really, in good faith, put out a transfer protocol that guys are transferring in the middle of a semester. And so that's kind of a problem, is there's just not really any great solution to this. I mean, one thing that's been floated out there that I think a lot of people would be on board with is the idea of the season should end earlier. The season should end on January 1st. And then you have this transfer portal philosophy. Could that happen in whatever the next playoff format is? Maybe conference championship games go away. Maybe it becomes more of an NFL model where you're playing every week instead of having these long breaks in between games. A lot still to be determined there. But in terms of this year, it does seem quite likely that the only transfer window for the 2026 offseason will be in the middle of a college ball playoff.
Yeah, it is interesting that you bring up the point of the academic calendar, the pesky academic calendar, as you call it, because Ross Bjork did say in June, if we ever say that we care about academics and we want to live by that, then I think the transfer portal window should be in spring. Now, I tend to agree with you that I think the happy medium is probably somewhere between what's been proposed and what Ross Bjork proposed in that comment. It seems like February, in the very immediate aftermath of when the season is over for everybody, is probably when it's most conducive for all parties involved to have a one-time portal involved. And I think that was probably around the time that I talked about with Johnny when we were discussing this topic over the summer, probably around the time that Bjork made those comments. I will say it's funny that you were so complimentary of Tony Petitti relative to advocating for Big Ten interest to the NCAA, because I'm sure every Michigan fan would agree with you on that front. Focusing on Ohio State specifically with this issue, let's assume that this goes through. and we're living in a world now where Ohio State has to participate in this effort. I largely think that the team, like in terms of just overall position groups, I think the team will be okay. They've done a good job of I mean, there's been a couple cycles now of this transfer portal where they've just gone out and they've gotten the best talent available, regardless of what position it is. The first year this happened, they went and got Justin Fields, and that obviously went spectacularly for everybody involved. Maybe not Georgia, but well, Georgia won a couple national championships after Fields left,
It
so
did
maybe
okay.
it did. Maybe they did okay. But they got Caleb Downs too, and obviously the team is still reaping the benefits from that. So there's already been a couple
That did
cycles where
not
they've
go as
gone.
well for Alabama.
Maybe not. They still got time to bounce back. We'll see what happens. It was the right decision for Downs, though, for sure. The one area where I've been encouraged by where they've kind of aggressively pivoted to the Wild West moment that college football kind of finds itself in relative to the portal is for all the complaints that we've heard from Ohio State fans about them missing out on big time offensive line recruits in the NIL era and in recent seasons. And that was a very common complaint under Justin Fry. And obviously now we have a new offensive line coach, and hopefully he's going to, be able to hit higher on those more heralded recruits. But in the event that they aren't able to do that, what they've done in recent years that they've had a lot of success with is they've gone out and they've gotten either proven commodities or guys that they identify as having high ceilings that haven't come close to scraping those yet, that they think with the resources and coaching they have available and an opportunity to compete at Ohio State, that they're going to be able to raise those guys up. And they've already proven with several different players, and even within this season already, in the case of Philip Daniels, they have already proven that they're able to raise those kind of guys up. But you still have to be able to make the case during the portal window that they should come here in order to do that. In the event that this were to go through, I would be worried about them having that to fall back on relative to them not quite having the recruiting part of the offensive line worked out the way that Ohio State fans ideally would want it relative to a lot of other premier programs. So I'm curious that in that scenario, would you share that same kind of concern that I have relative to just kind of how I laid it all out, or are you more optimistic that having to operate in this environment, they would be able to rectify the issue, as they would have to kind of lean more heavily back into aggressively recruiting as opposed to finding talent through the portal for those positions?
I think it's a valid concern, but I think Ohio State can adapt because, I mean, the new system here that would be in place would not really be that different than what's already been in place. I mean, this past year, they made a run to the national championship game in the midst. And keep in mind, like, the portal opened last year. Ohio State's coming off the worst loss in a long, long time for the program. And, I think most of the commitments did come after they won the Tennessee game. But nevertheless,
Hey, correct me if I'm wrong. I think Ethan Onion was actually at the Cotton Bowl on the sidelines. Was he
oh, yeah.
not?
Most of the mid-year guys were like Max Clare, CJ Donaldson, Philip Daniels, even on all those guys were there. But, that to that point is like, other than Bo Atkinson, basically all the guys they got in the transfer portal this past year were guys they brought in while they were in the midst of a college football playoff run. Now, I think this timing would be a little more difficult because of the fact that you had those like 3 weeks in between the season ending and playing Tennessee last year. In this case, you're talking about the portal. The portal window would basically be like concurrent with your week of preparing for a semifinal game if you advance that far. So no doubt it would be a challenge, but I also think like Ohio State has shown it can adapt, it can succeed in this environment. And so I don't think that it would suddenly mean that Ohio State's going to get no talent from the transfer portal. Just means guys like Mark Mantoni, guys who are, I think the importance of that recruiting staff, Mark Pantoni and all the other people who they're not coaches, but they're player personnel people. They would the importance of them would become even more than it already is, because if you're Ryan Day, you would have to almost entirely rely on those guys to make your evaluations for you, because you wouldn't have time to be evaluating transfers on film. You have to have all your focus on that semifinal opponent.
Gotcha. Well, we still have about 3 weeks before this would actually get potentially ratified by the NCAA. So it'll be interesting to see if any of the advocating that the Big Ten coaches or the other prominent Power Five program coaches or Tony Petitti and the other commissioners, if their sort of advocation ends up steering this in another direction. Again, I think we both kind of agree it'd be nice to see them get it a little bit further into February if they're going to stick to one. But as is proposed right now, it would be at the very start of the new year, concurrent with around when that semifinal round is. So we'll see what takes shape in the next 3 weeks, and I'm sure we'll end up talking about it when the time comes around, 3 weeks from now, next month, here on the Dubcast. But until then, thank you very much for tuning in, and we will be back tomorrow morning to talk special teams with our another member of the 11 Warriors beat, Andy Anders. Once again, we want to give a quick thank you to our sponsor, First Bank of Central Ohio, the official bank of 11 Warriors, for sponsoring the 11 Dubcast and 11 Warriors this Ohio State football season. Dan, thanks for joining me today. We'll have you back to talk the Ohio game this coming weekend. Until then, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you tomorrow. Take care, folks.